Hi, everybody. So as Sean already said perfectly, my name is Jonathan Maltz. I'll be talking to you about code review today. If after this presentation you have questions, comments, concerns, jokes that you want to send my way, you can do that through email at maltz@yelp.com, or you can send those to me via Twitter as @maltzj. As you can guess from my t-shirt, Yelp's mission is to connect I work at Yelp. Yelp's mission is to connect people with great local businesses. And one of the big ways that we do that is through code review. As long as I've been at Yelp, we've had a really strong culture of code review. Every change that goes out into production at Yelp, whether it is written by a new grad on their first day, or if our SVP of engineering is shipping code to production, that would get reviewed as well. And so since I graduated, I've been working at Yelp. And so I've always been really impressed with how we've caused this code review culture to sort of continue to perpetuate. It existed at 100 engineers, and it continues to exist now that we're at 500 plus engineers. And a lot of that is really intentional. We have things like code review guidelines, which are documents that talk about how we believe that people should review code at Yelp. We also, when I first joined our Android team, we had a code review mentorship program, where as part of your onboarding process, someone taught you, this is how we review code, this is what we think about, this is how we do this effectively and why we do it. So in my mind, that was sort of how every team functioned. And then around 2 years ago, I had the pleasure of working on our E24 team after they had just been acquired. And E24 was a very different animal than Yelp. They had been fully in execution mode for the last 10 years, and they have been incredibly successful in execution mode. They had gotten a company acquired for over $100 million. As part of being in execution mode, they hadn't really built up that culture of code review. And as part of bringing them into, oh no, we're going the wrong way. As part of bringing them into the sort of Yelp family, we wanted to bring a culture of code review to E24. But the problem was we realized pretty early on that we couldn't just like helicopter drop what we were doing at Yelp for the last 8 years and put it into E24 and have the two work together. Things just don't work like that. So what we did was we went around and we talked to a lot of people that we really appreciated how they reviewed code and sort of found some first principles that they used that we could sort of use to blend the Yelp code review culture and the E24 code review culture. So then after that, I started, as you can imagine, I started leading a team at E24, and I felt like this dog. And that I really had no idea what I was doing when it came to code review. Now I was responsible for sort of the output of 8 to 10 people, and I had to figure out which code should I be reviewing. Theoretically, I could have spent all day just sitting there reviewing code and not actually get anything done. So again, I found that there weren't really any blog posts written about this, and there's no conference talks. So I did what I always do when I encounter these problems. I talked to all my friends, all my mentors, and found that everyone had their own little bespoke solution to this problem. And so what I wanted to do today was I wanted to sort of provide the findings from all those discussions, whether it's about why do we do code review, how to do code review, or how to find the right code to review with you all so that if you all encounter these same types of challenges, you won't feel like you need to hopelessly scour the internet for resources that don't exist. So what do we talk about today? First, we'll talk about why to do code review in the first place. Then we'll talk about sort of the basic outline of conducting a code review. Then we'll talk about how to give code review feedback. And lastly, we'll talk about this sort of challenging question of, I could review tons of code. How do I find the right code to review on my team? So first, I wanted to talk about why do code review in the first place. Ultimately, like, I write code. My code never has bugs in it. And so like, why should I even subject my code to the shenanigans of code review if it never has bugs in the first place? And the first answer is because as much as I like to believe that my code is bug-free, code review is a really great check to make sure that code is correct. In the book Code Complete, which is sort of one of the initial texts on software engineering, it's like this huge textbook if you've never seen it. They cite this stat that by virtue of having inspections of code before it went to production, a team was able to cut the defect rates on their product by 80%. 80% fewer bugs shipped to production just by having a second person look at that code. Now, I'm not going to promise you that your crash rate is going to, like, you're going to cut your crash rate by 80% if you just, like, make sure that someone looks at your code, because there's a lot of other things going on there. But the idea of having a second set of eyes to review code and make sure that it's correct will help make sure that you're shipping fewer bugs to production. The next piece is that code review helps make sure that your code is well designed. Ultimately, designing software, as anyone who's listened to one of the talks about architecture or software design the past couple of days can tell you, it's sort of a hard, squishy, messy problem to figure out. And the best way that we have to resolve those hard, squishy, messy problems is to get a bunch of opinions together and sort of build a consensus around what's the best way to go forward. That's what all the research on why diverse teams are so important tells us. And so by virtue of forcing yourself to have someone review your code before it goes into production, you get those alternate opinions and you get a better result at the end. Lastly, code review helps us share knowledge. As anyone who saw, if you saw Sam's keynote yesterday, you'll know that he talked about this idea of how it's impossible to learn everything in the Android space. There's AR core, there's Android things, there's architecture, there's RxJava, there's Kotlin coroutines. There's no way any one person on your team can have that internalized in their brain all the time. So by virtue of having code review, it gives a really structured place where teams can take things that they learned at conferences or in blog posts and share them with each other in a way that helps the whole team get stronger as a result. So how do we make that happen? What are sort of the tactics of doing a code review? The first step in a code review is you want to build context. Because ultimately, it's hard to make sure that code is correct and well designed if you don't know what that code is trying to do in the first place. So building context is a couple of steps. First and foremost, it means understanding what this code is trying to accomplish. And there's a subtle thing here where there's sort of two pieces you want to understand. The first is you want to understand what does the author want this code to do? What library are they trying to integrate? What algorithm are they trying to implement? What was their goal when they set out to do this? The other piece of this, though, is you want to understand why they're doing it in the first place. Are we putting retrofit into our application because we need a background task processing framework? That's probably not the right solution. So when you're building this context, make sure that you're understanding both what the author is doing, but also why they're doing it in the first place, so that you can make sure the solution that they have is correct for the problem that they're working on. Next, you want to understand what's out of scope. Ultimately, I don't think any of us ship code in any of us make applications in one giant diff. And so there's always going to be things that are left out of a particular change set. So maybe it's bugs that will be addressed in a follow-up, or some tech debt you're going to leave around because it's really hard to clean up right now. I know none of us ever introduce tech debt, but I'll be honest that sometimes I do it. I'll take that bullet. But so ultimately, you don't want to sort of relitigate those discussions or force the person who wrote that code to re-explain it to you once they've already made that decision. That just slows the process down. Lastly, you want to understand any high-level decisions that were already made. So if the code author sort of evaluated OK HTTP versus volley and decided that they should use OK HTTP, you want to understand that ahead of time, and you want to understand that why they did that. And again, the goal here is that because the author has probably already put a lot of time into making these decisions, and you don't want to force them to have to just re-go through that thought process with you just because you didn't take the time to build the context to understand it. Now, failure here is something that I have been known to fall victim to, which is I get really excited whenever I start to do a code review. I'm like, I'm going to share some knowledge, I'm going to improve some design, we're going to collaborate and make this better. And then I forget to read why we're doing that code review in the first place. And I leave a couple of comments, and the author's like, dude, if you just look at the description section, I've explained all of this already. People are much kinder than that, but that's my mental model of it's like, oh, I should have read that. So it's really important that you make sure that you're taking the time to do this, again, to keep that process moving along. The other thing is, once you've built this context, one big failure mode is not calling for backup as necessary. So what I mean by this is oftentimes when you're reviewing code along the boundary lines of your application, so say along the API levels, there will be a lot of context that you need to understand in order to make sure that that code is actually correct. One example of this was one time we changed a GET request to a POST request in our application, and it brought down the entire website because of how it had to do with how requests are routed and some complications of Yelp infrastructure. But that's a case where the Android code was totally correct. Click that ship it button and perfect change from a GET to a POST. But the context required in order to fully evaluate the correctness didn't just live in Android. And that reviewer might have needed to call from backup from someone who knew more about the server side. And the thing is, authors are just as important as code reviewers in this step. Because ultimately, it's really hard for your code reviewer to do a good job of building context if you don't give them the context up in front. And the way that you do this is through this field. This is Review Board, which is what we use at Yelp, but GitHub, Bitbucket, Crucible, Fabricator, I'm sure they all have something similar, where it's like basically a big section where you can basically describe what your change is. And what you want to do with this section is all the same stuff that you do whenever you're writing a commit message. You want to say why you're doing this. You want to say what you're trying to do. You want to sort of provide JIRA tickets or whatever task tracker you use so that people understand why this is happening. I won't go too much into the details, but there is a great article that I'll link at the end that talks about how to write great commit messages. And what I try to do is I try to strive to make sure that when I write a commit message, I don't need to add anything else to my code review, to the code review, and all of that information is already present. So that way information is both in the commit logs and in the code review. And one pro tip for what's really beneficial here is using pre-filled templates. I know that Review Board and GitHub both allow this, but what these are custom files that you can add that provide sort of templates for questions that people should answer or checklists that people should follow as part of shipping a diff to production. This can be really beneficial to make sure that people are answering the questions that they need to answer in order to make sure that everyone can build the context that they need. So once you've sort of built up that context, the next step is to be evaluating that code review at a little bit more of a detailed level. So now you want to be thinking about at the method level or maybe at the class level, what does the correctness and the design of this code look like? So what success really here looks like is it looks like doing what my friend Ken calls providing high-value code review feedback. So these are things that like really leverage your creativity and your understanding of software development to help you work together with the author to help make that code more correct and better designed. So this is stuff like providing high-level design feedback, thinking about test coverage. Like, did we get 100% test coverage just because we wrote some bad tests? Or did we do it because we wrote really good tests? Do we need to write different tests or more tests? Also, if there's like a new or different way of doing things, what you want to do is you want to be linking to blog posts or articles in order to share that way with your teammates. Now, at the same time, there's also a failure mode here, which is providing low-value code review feedback. So again, as my friend Ken says, not all code review feedback is created equal. If you're leaving feedback for something that a computer could automatically catch, whether it's braces that are misaligned or lint checks that could automatically happen or unoptimized imports, all of those things are both not a good use of your time as a reviewer, and it's also not a good use of your author's time because now they need to go and fix those things themselves. So what you want to do is, as much as possible, you want to automate as much of that. So you want to use PMD, lint, find bugs, check style, Google Java format, and you want to put those as pre-commit hooks if they're fast, or run them on CI as part of a Jenkins job with every review whenever you do your changes. And this is to make sure that you're using sort of the unique abilities that we have as humans to make our code better, as opposed to doing things that computers should be doing for us. Now, you'll also find that there are some things that computers just can't do well for us. So maybe there's like Hungarian notation. Whether you should have an M or not have an M in front of your variables is not something that a computer can necessarily detect great for us yet. And so in those cases, what you really want to avoid is you want to avoid having the same discussion on every code review about, oh, should we use Hungarian notation here? I don't know. Like, just make a decision, and then if someone violates that decision, say, we agreed on this a while ago, use Hungarian notation or don't use Hungarian notation. That'll help keep the process of shipping code reviews much faster. And lastly, once you've evaluated for correctness and design at that method and that class level, you want to take a step back and think about sort of at the code at a sort of more macro level. And think about, could this be done better? Could it be done faster? Is there an easier way that this can be done? Ultimately, as a code author, it's sometimes really easy to get bogged down, to get sort of really focused on how to implement this one specific thing. So one of the great benefits that you can provide as a code reviewer is you can come in and sort of sit back in your chair and say, you know, maybe if we applied this other language feature that we didn't initially think about here, that would make this process much easier. And ultimately, doing this effectively is really, really hard. It requires keeping in your head what decisions have been made, what discussions you've already had, like the context of why this change is making. And both the reviewer and the author need to do this. And so every time there's a minute that's away from those discussions is time when that context is atrophying in people's brains. So you want to be really, really sure to keep turnaround time high or quick between iterations of a code review. At Yelp, we shoot to have 24 hours between either the author or the reviewer publishing feedback of some sort. Now, the way that this can fail really easily is that you just forget to do code reviews. But there are also some really sort of pernicious ways that this can happen as well without you even thinking about it. So to consider that, take two entirely fictitious Android developers, one named Lisa and one named Sam, and think about sort of a happy path. In a happy path, Lisa sends Sam a code review. Sam's able to turn that code review around quickly, and everyone stays happy. Now, what happens if Sam maybe has a deadline, or he forgets to do a code review, or he's on vacation for a day, and Lisa sends him a code review, and he doesn't get to it. And then Lisa's like, well, I don't have anything else to do. I need to keep working on this library. And so she then sends him another code review. Sam still isn't able to get to it for another reason. So then Lisa sends him another one, and then another one. And before you know it, Sam's feeling really sad because he has this giant queue of code reviews that he needs to get through in order just to go back to doing feature development and sort of like doing the stuff that he's actively working on. And the bad part of this is that even if Sam were to effectively turn around one of these code reviews back to Lisa, Lisa doesn't have anything. Lisa's just like waiting for Sam to review her code at this point. So she can just put it right back on his plate. And Sam's in this really unhappy place where he doesn't get to do any feature development. His code reviews are probably worse, and he's unhappy because all he's doing is reviewing code all the time. So the way to avoid this is, first and foremost, just be conscious of the amount of code reviews that you are submitting to someone. At Yelp, we have a tool, we call it Ship This, which shows how much code a particular person has to review, how many lines they're currently responsible for. And that's really helpful in terms of seeing should I send this code review to Protip or should I send it to Paul? If Protip has 2,000 lines of code he currently needs to review, probably shouldn't be sending it to Protip right now. And so in general, you want to shoot whenever you're working with someone to have 1 to 2 code reviews and get those really shipped before you move on to submitting more. And if you find yourself in a place where maybe you only have one other person on your team and you can't find another person to review that code, ultimately don't submit more code reviews. There are tons of things you can do on your team, whether it's like doing little improvements to your CI infrastructure or like investigating the next task that you need to do, which don't generate code reviews and will give your code reviewer time to catch up. So cool. That's the basics of a code review outline. And next, I wanted to talk about something very near and dear to my heart, which is how to give effective feedback on code reviews. And much like Buddy the Elf, I love feedback, and feedback is my favorite. And especially effective code review is my favorite. Because ultimately, code review is one of the most frequent ways that your team will be interacting with each other. If I think about our team at Yelp, my particular team, we've probably submitted 3 design documents over the past, say, week. But we've put out like 40 or 45 code reviews across all of our platforms. So the way that we're communicating on code reviews is really shaping the way that we're making decisions and how we move forward and have dialogues about what code we're going to ship. So whenever I think about sort of the way that I want to give feedback, there's a few things that I think are really important to encourage. The first is discussion and collaboration. Again, these are hard, squishy, complicated problems, and the best way we have to solve those is by talking about them and getting collaboration and getting a lot of discussion about how to make that happen. At the same time, you also don't want code review to feel like this just arbitrary hoop that people have to jump through. You want people to send out that code review and not just like wait for feedback and be like, oh yeah, my senior engineer told me I had to do this, so I'll just like do what they tell me to. No, you want people to be owning these code reviews and really actively pushing them through to production and being active in that process. And ultimately, this is because this is an incredibly powerful way for your team to share information and give and get feedback from each other. People all the time I know are talking about, oh man, my manager doesn't, I talk to managers all the time and they talk about, oh yeah, people don't give me enough feedback, or their reports say, oh man, I want more feedback. Like, you're getting constant feedback through code review from your teammates telling you how you can write your code better and different patterns that you can use. So really celebrate that and take advantage of it so that your whole team can be the best developers that you can be. Now the failure mode here is feedback that makes people feel worse. So anytime you're giving feedback that sort of shuts down that discussion, it shuts down collaboration, it makes people feel like they're in a place where they aren't owning the code review and they're just responding to what other people are saying, is sort of feedback that is going to not be as productive. And this can come up, I mean, there's the obvious way that this can happen where you have someone who's just like actively mean and abusive on a code review. And that's not a good situation. That shouldn't be happening at all. But there's also a bunch of subtle ways this can happen. So you can get feedback like, your style here is inconsistent. Align your braces with our code style. Or this code has a bug when it's running on Lollipop. Fix it. Both of these, again, are definitely code review that comes from a good place, and it strives to improve the correctness of the code. But again, it robs the individual of that ownership, and it just turns it into this sort of passive thing that people are doing that someone else is going to tell them how to fix their code. The other way that this can go wrong is the value judgment type of feedback. So saying stuff like, why'd you do this? This code was better in its previous form. It's really easy for us to say like, oh yeah, we're software engineers. We're just talking about the code here, so like don't take it personally. But I don't know about you all, but like I take a lot of pride in the work that I do. And whenever I get feedback that's like, this is really bad, like that means that I did a bad job and that doesn't feel good. So all of this code review, again, has really great intention, but the end result is that it might not be the best thing possible. So the mindset that I try to approach every code review with is something that I took from my friend Brad. And he teaches all of his mentees this mindset of, this code is good, let's make it better. So he goes into every code review by already celebrating the fact that this person has done a great job and been successful, and then they're going to work together to build on top of that. So you're like, okay, cool, that, as Lisa would say, that sounds kind of hippy-dippy. How do I do that? That's actual Lisa, not fictitious code review Lisa. And the first thing is whenever you're giving feedback, you want to start with neutral facts. So an example of this is if you're leaving code review feedback and you say the style guidelines say that you should put braces on the same line, and this code puts braces on a new line. Align your braces with our style guide. Again, at the end here, we're sort of robbing the individual ownership by giving very prescriptive, dictatorial feedback. But the beginning of this is a neutral fact. You can read the documentation about what your style guidelines say, and you can read the code. And there's no way that you can disagree with this statement, assuming that it is true. So this helps to sort of take a step back from the sort of value judgment by just starting with neutral facts that no one can disagree with. Now there's a failure mode here, and that's that thinking that your opinions are actually facts. And this can be really easy to have it happen. So an example of a fact is that static methods cannot be mocked in normal JUnit tests. Fact. Like, try to do something different and you will have a bad time. I will promise you that much. Now, an opinion is static methods are bad. They cannot be mocked in JUnit tests. Immediately once we've made a value judgment about whether static methods are good or not, we've changed that statement about a limitation of static methods to being a value judgment about how good they are. And that has turned this into an opinion. Now, maybe your team avoids static methods because you generally tend to avoid static methods because they can't be mocked in JUnit tests, and that makes testing hard. But at the same time, there might be some benefits that come with static methods. Maybe you really like the fact that they force you to be explicit about your state management or something like that. And so generally, when you're starting with facts, you really want to be mindful of, am I saying an actual fact, or am I saying something that I think and is my opinion, and I'm just couching it as a fact? Because I think so often in software engineering, it can be easy to fall into that trap of saying, oh, these are my opinions, and couching them as facts. And whenever you're sharing these facts, you want to be linking to external resources as much as possible. So if you're talking about the problems with constructor overloading, so constructor overloading can make it confusing to figure out which parameters are being set at a particular time. You want to be linking to external resources, link to effective Java items, link to blog posts, link to documentation, tech talks. All of these things are incredibly valuable because they mean that you can sort of leave one sentence of feedback, link to an external resource, and suddenly now your teammate who knew nothing about Kotlin coroutines or something like that can watch a talk from earlier today and get all of that knowledge, and you can keep that knowledge circulating throughout your team. So once you've started with facts, the next step is invited discussion. And there's a really magical trick to do this. So we'll take our example here and say the style guidelines say that we should put braces on the same line, and this code puts braces on a new line. Can you align your braces with our style guide? The addition of the words "can you" and ending the sentence with a question mark has totally changed the way, at least for me, I know I interpret this feedback. Now I can say, as if I were receiving this feedback, I can say, you know what, you're totally right. I didn't read the style guidelines. I'll go and do that. But now maybe there's a really good reason that I didn't do this in the first place. And the answer to this question is like, there's like some random thing with how long our variable names are and like the way that parentheses are set up and the syntax I'm using here that makes it impossible to do that. And so it doesn't feel like a huge lift for someone to disagree with you now or to provide an alternate solution because ultimately you've opened up a discussion about what the approach should be rather than dictating this is the correct solution. If you're unsure about how to make this happen, take the thing you want the person to do, put the words "can you" and then a question mark at the end, and congratulations, you've just invited a discussion. It's actually that easy. Next is, and finally, the last step is like a little language hack that I like to use. And that's to replace the word "you" in your code review feedback with the word "we" or "us." This is like super subtle, but it is incredibly powerful because it shapes the discussion from one which is about me telling you what you should do about your code to us deciding what we are happy with in our code. Because ultimately, the code that you ship today is code that I'm responsible for maintaining when you're on vacation. And then when both of us leave in a year and a half, it's the new hire's job to maintain that. So we're not having this discussion about whether you've done the right thing. We're having this discussion about whether or not this is code we're happy with having in our application. So an example of what change this makes is can we align our braces with our style guide? This immediately puts you and the author on the same team and helps with that discussion and that collaboration. This also, you'll find that sometimes the question comes up whenever I'm talking to people at this feedback style. It's sometimes I just need to tell someone to do a thing. The new hire just needs to know that static factories are bad, and they just need to learn that. And leaving aside whether or not static factories are actually bad, because that's an opinion and not a fact, using this allows you to have a little bit more of a collaborative way of explaining that. So you can use the word let's. So say, let's align our braces with our style guide. And now it's, again, something that we're doing together as opposed to something that I'm dictating to you. Ultimately, I try to still sort of invite feedback by using questions as a first feedback. But if I'm sort of being a little bit more prescriptive, using the word let's can be really helpful. Now, the failure mode here is turning into this guy from XKCD. And I know I've fallen victim to this before, where my teammate sends something out for code review, and I disagree with how they're managing state or something like that. And so both of us start going back and forth and citing blog posts and sharing tech talks about the one true meaning of state management on Android. The guy in the front smiling, because that means he's honest about the fact that he's had this happen to him. Everyone else is pretending like it hasn't. And so this is crazy, right? Because these people are your teammates, and you're supposed to be collaborating with them and working together to figure out how you can find the best possible design through this process. And instead, you're arguing with them as if they're someone that's on the other side of the country when they're sitting 7 feet away from you. So don't make this happen. And the way to avoid preventing this from happening is using what my friend Alex calls the rule of 3. So the rule of 3 simply states that after 3 comments on a code review, you are not allowed to resolve any more questions on that code review. So what you need to do is reviewer makes a comment, author makes a comment, reviewer responds. If the author still disagrees, they are not allowed to post that in the code review. Both people must step away from the keyboard and have a discussion, ideally with their voices if they're co-located, about what they should do in order to resolve this. If you're not co-located, you can use Hangouts, you can use Slack, but you can't figure that answer out on the code review itself. Because ultimately, code review is really great for discussing what should a particular change do. Is this change good? How can we improve the design? It's not good for higher level discussions about how to make sure that the code is the best it can possibly be. And so in those discussions, a great suggestion that I heard for how to frame them is this quote from a woman named Laura Hogan, who's the VP of engineering at Kickstarter. And she says, one of her senior engineers one time was on a scale of 1 to 10, I care about this thing at a 5. What about you? And what are your major concerns? And this is an amazing thing because it forces people, it's so easy to be vehemently disagreeing with someone because dang it, we need to be right as software engineers. But in reality, you're arguing about whether you should use tabs or spaces, and it doesn't actually matter all that much. But really, the right answer is spaces. And so what you'll do is once you start having these discussions and you force people to actually be explicit about what it is they're concerned about, you'll find a couple of things come up. The first is you might find that people have totally different concerns. My teammate and I had this exact experience on a code review that I recently submitted. I was sort of concerned about our ability to find Gradle files. He was concerned about about sort of the way that our CI infrastructure would be set up if we had all these weird names for our build.gradle files. How would that work? And we were just coming at this from very different concerns. Ultimately, we decided that the risk was too great. But if we were really both concerned about that, we could maybe have figured out a third way that sort of figured out a way to make sure that our CI infrastructure was really good, while at the same time making sure that our Gradle files were easily searchable. At the same time, you might also find that there's a really large difference. So someone might care about this at a 9, and someone might care about this at a 2. In that case, my friend Carmen says the principle of the person who cares the most in the code review is what you should do. And I think that that's a really great rule to follow because, again, it keeps that velocity high. And if one person doesn't care that much, chances are doing it the other person's way will not be a big impact on correctness or the design of that application. Now, there's a caveat here, which is there are 2 ways you can employ this rule. One is you can employ it not very frequently, and you can care a lot about very few things. The second is you can employ it very frequently and average out to a 5. What you are not allowed to do is you're not allowed to always be the person who cares the most in the code review, because then you just seem like a dictatorial jerk. And so if you find yourself in a position where you're using this frequently, then what you find is chances are maybe you're thinking to yourself, oh, I'm just trying to keep the team's code quality high. But you need to think about what impact that's having on your teammates if you're always being this stick in the mud who's saying, no, we can't do it this way because I care a lot about it. And so if you're going to be doing that a lot, please do make sure to think about averaging out to a 5. Lastly, if you're both high, you want to think about making a larger decision. So maybe you're like, I don't know, maybe I think that we should use Kotlin here, and I think that we should really put Kotlin into our application. And someone's like, Kotlin will make our build times longer. That's a terrible idea. And ultimately, that's not something that you're going to resolve on a code review. That's code that someone's already written, and in that code review moment, they're looking to get feedback about how good was this Kotlin implementation that I had. So if you're both really high and you have the same type of concerns and they're very disagreeing, take a step back, have a discussion again around a whiteboard, maybe like in a design document, or gasp a meeting in order to figure out what your team wants to do in order to solve these larger questions. And lastly, this is something that my teammate Paul once taught me, is don't forget to celebrate the good stuff. It can be so easy once you have sort of tools in your toolkit to give feedback that you think is effective, to be like, oh yeah, I'm just like, I have this great tool to give feedback. I never need to tell people that they're doing great because dang it, I give this super collaborative feedback all the time. It doesn't work that way. People still need to be told that they're doing a great job, and they need to be reminded that like you really appreciate all the good stuff that you're doing. That they are doing. So like use a ta-da emoji, use a ++, use a smiley face when someone uses a cool new pattern. Like call out the great things that people are doing, because ultimately then when you need to have one of these discussions where you're disagreeing, it'll make that process much easier because you've built up a ton of trust with them. Lastly, I wanted to jump into Code Review 201, which is finding the right code to review. And before I do that, I wanted to take a detour into feedback types. And so what I mean by this is that there's sort of a scale of how to think about giving feedback on a code review. The first is this idea that I call blocking feedback. So this is feedback that are big concerns that you have that you at least want addressed before the code gets pushed to production. So maybe it gets addressed as saying, you know what, we're going to do this in a follow-up. Or maybe it's an intentional decision to not make a particular change. But ultimately, this is a big concern that you have, and you want to make sure there's a discussion about it. So this can be things like code smells, lacking test coverage, like big possible refactors. And for those, you want to use the same feedback structure we just talked about. Start with a fact, KitKat doesn't support elevation, which means this will crash on all the devices. Can we use viewcompat instead? Start a discussion, see if you can figure out how to do that. The other type, though, is something that I feel like I don't see people use enough, and that's this idea of non-blocking feedback. So non-blocking feedback are all those, like, I know for me, I have like all these ideas that pop into my head, and it's like, you know, what if we did this thing a different way? I'm not actually sure if this is a good idea, but again, we're going to be better by talking about this stuff. And so I at least want to throw it out there for someone to consider. So this could be things like an alternate design, maybe renaming some stuff, maybe doing some opportunistic refactoring. And in those cases, I want to leave that feedback in a way that says, hey, look, this is just an idea that I'm throwing out there, and if you disagree with this, like just ignore this comment and pretend it never happened so that we can keep code review velocity high. The important thing here in order to make that happen is to signal effectively that this feedback is actually non-blocking. So you can do this by saying, not sure if this is a good idea, or you can just say, non-blocking, : what if we do this thing? You'll find that this helps you both encourage more discussions, while at the same time making sure that your team is able to continue shipping code reviews quickly. So cool, back on track. First, in order to find the right code to review, first step is get all the code reviews that your team does to forward it to you. Yes, I know that this means you will receive more emails, and all of us get too many emails. But like, set up a Gmail filter or a Hotmail filter or like an Outlook filter, whatever you use, and put them into a separate folder and review this like once a day or something like that. This has a couple of benefits. First and foremost is as if you're sort of in a position where you're trying to keep tabs on what your team as a whole is doing, it gives you a really great low pass filter is my team doing the right thing? Because if your team's shipping code reviews and the names on the code reviews are like mostly the right thing, like chances are nothing's going to explode if you don't get involved with that. And ultimately the name of the game if you're trying to find the right code to review is find places where code's going to explode if you don't get involved. The other thing that this allows you to do is it allows you to sort of have a high, again, a low fidelity view, or like a 50,000 foot view of what's everything that my team is doing. So like that way you know, oh, this is an opportunity for me to jump in and prevent something from possibly blowing up. So again, Put these all into a separate folder, review it at the end of the day, review it every other day, but make sure you're able to get yourself that visibility. Once you have all those, once you're seeing that, you want to evaluate all those code reviews across a 2x2 matrix. The first axis is risk. So risk is the question I just talked about. It's this question of if I do nothing on this code review, what is the possibility that something goes bad? So some things that could cause this to go bad are like, if you have a new hire who doesn't understand your team's style guide or their processes or how RxJava works, like chances are there's a greater chance that they're going to ship bugs in a particular code review. If there's an inexperienced code reviewer reviewing a piece of code, chances are that code, there's more likely that that code is going to have some bugs in it or have some design issues. If the code's really complex and maybe you're the only one who understands it, then that's sort of an opportunity where it might be more risky. Or maybe your team like really struggles with something, and so you want to make sure to review it to make sure that your team improves in that regard. The other axis is opportunity. And opportunity is this slightly more fuzzy question, which is, if I leave a comment on this code review right now, what is the opportunity that something really awesome happens that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't said anything? So this could be like if you're trying to evangelize a new technology on your team. So you're trying to be like, oh yeah, Kotlin's the best. And you want to show people that that's happening. Like if you jump onto a code review and show someone, oh yeah, you see these 50 lines of code you wrote here. Actually, these would be 20 lines of Kotlin code. That makes that code review be even better than it would otherwise be. It also is a really great opportunity if you have super efficient developers to sort of suggest ways that they might be able to push themselves and go above and beyond. Once you've done that, you want to think about all the code reviews across these two axes, and you'll find low risk, low opportunity ones. These just like don't look at them unless you have to. Maybe you're on the project and so you're getting assigned to them, or the project needs to keep moving along and so you want to do those. But if they're things that you're not necessarily looking at actively, things will be okay if you don't get involved. Next, you'll find things that are high risk but low opportunity. So these are things, again, that new hire is putting out their first code review. Or there's like a really tricky piece of code that you want to make sure to look at. You want to review those with an eye towards having blocking feedback. Because again, the concern is correctness, and blocking feedback is really good when you want something addressed really before something gets shipped. Next, you'll find high risk, high opportunity code reviews. So these are things like big refactors, maybe of important flows of your application, big adoptions of a new technology, sort of a couple of the first foundational code reviews that will set up a large project. And the big thing here is, first, do you have a plan? Because ultimately, maybe you don't necessarily need to be the person who's reviewing this code, but you need to make sure that people have thought about the fact that this is a big, risky change, and they have a plan to roll back if there's a problem. And maybe you want to make sure that that's happening, and maybe you want to get involved in order to make sure that those decisions are made well. The last area, which is my secret favorite area, is the low risk, high opportunity code reviews. And so these are great opportunities to provide non-blocking feedback, and I think this is something that people who are like technical leads, I haven't seen them use enough really, which is ways to sort of like poke the team and nudge them in directions that they might not otherwise think about. So what you could do is you could say like, this class has always felt a little clunky to me. Now that we're in here, what if we cleaned it up? This sort of helps your team say, hey, we should have this continual process of continually improving our code. You're not being super heavy-handed about it, but you're just continually poking people towards that direction of we should be continually refactoring stuff. And if they're like, no, I disagree with you, then you're like, okay, cool, we'll drop it and we'll move on. Hasn't taken up much of our time. Now there's a warning here, and that's this perceived authority graph here. Very scientific graph of the perceived, and what it says is that no matter how egalitarian you try to make your team, so no matter how much you try to say, we have a flat organizational structure, we're a startup, we execute fast, there's always going to be this perceived authority where once someone has been around a while, or they have the name lead next to them, or they have any sort of influence within the team, anyone who doesn't have that influence or is new to the team will see even non-blocking feedback and think, oh, my technical lead told me that I have to do that. I need to go do that. And so there are some ways that I found to prevent that. And the first one is whenever you're, especially if you're dealing with people who are more junior, argue both sides of the case. So if you're talking about, say, an opportunistic refactor, you can come in and you can say, so I'm wondering if we should clean up this code here, but it might take a really long time, and I don't know, is this project on a deadline or something like that, and maybe this might not be the right time to do that. And in that case, it sort of provides the opportunity for the person who you're talking to agree with either version of you that they want to. This is also really great in terms of like teaching people to think through things. So once you're providing both sides of the question, they can take a side and you can be like, oh, what are the outcomes of doing that? It's just a great way to sort of mentor and teach people some skills that they might not otherwise get. Other thing you can do, call out a problem. So say, this class looks really messy right now. Is there anything that you think we can do about that? Maybe they say, no, I don't think that there's anything really good. And then maybe you just sort of let that drop and it isn't the biggest deal. And lastly, the important thing to remember is that as you're doing this, you should be inviting these people to pair with you. So if you're leaving non-blocking feedback that's asking people to go above and beyond, ultimately you're asking them to do additional work because you think that it'll benefit the code base. And that means the onus is on you to some extent to make sure that they're successful. So give them all the resources that they need and make sure that you're saying, hey, if you want to do this, I'm here for you if you have any questions, because I know this wasn't initially on your plate, but trust us, it'll make us better in the long run. So that's all I've got for today. Thank you so much for listening. Real quick, I wanted to, they always say you should take 3 things home from a code review and also a talk. And so I hope you have more than 3 things. My 3 things are make sure you're not overwhelming people with code reviews, phrase your feedback as a question, and don't always be the person who cares the most. I'm going to leave this slide up because I know that people like to take pictures of external resources slides. So these are really great external resources. These are all really great tools for a variety of things, whether it's our open source code review guidelines, happiness, honesty, kindness, inspiration, pick 3, which is a great structured feedback mechanism that your team can use that like uses similar tenets in a different way. Giving and getting technical help, my personal favorite conference talk of all time, because ultimately code reviews are about giving and getting technical help. Crucial Conversations, my favorite book about giving feedback of all time, as well as a bunch of other awesome stuff. Bettercode.reviews also has a bunch of really tactical ways that code review can go wrong, as well as my favorite title on here, How to Use Code Review to Execute Someone's Soul, which is really, really just a lovely title. So yeah, I work at Yelp. We're hiring if you want to review my code or you want me to review your code. And does anyone have any questions? Got one in the front.
Sometimes when you are in a rush, it's difficult to, for example, what kind of approach do you use to do code review? Because you have to do your job and also you have to do the code review.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, I think for us, one of the big things is that there's an expectation with everyone across the board, whether it's like if our most senior product manager came to me and was like, look, we need this change done now. I'm like, okay, that's cool. But I can write this code for you and I can do it in a really dirty, hacky way, but I'm gonna need someone to code review it because that's just how we do things. So like again, the cultural piece of it of code gets pushed, or like code gets written and code gets reviewed is a really huge part to make sure that there's time for it. The other piece of it is, again, that idea of like having context on the code review can really help smooth that process. So say that you need, say that there's like a quick bug fix that needs to go out and there's like a dirty hack because the website's breaking or something like that. You put that context on the code review and the person's like, everyone knows we all understand this is a dirty hack, but we're gonna follow up on Monday because it's Friday night and it's Friday afternoon and we need to fix this for the weekend. So like having that context on the code review can really help make sure that people are doing the correct code review for sort of the correct level of urgency of the change.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. Nice slides.
Thank you.
What do you do when you're drowning in code reviews from multiple people?
The short answer is, my assumption is, are you in this situation at, hypothetically? Short answer is, you train people to do code reviews better. A lot of that, like the times when we've seen that happen have been you just brought a bunch of junior engineers onto your team, and so the senior engineer is the person who's like responsible for doing all those code reviews. And so one of the things is, you need to make it part, like the person who is drowning in code reviews needs to make it a part of their job to train other people. One way that we've done this at Yelp is a lot of teams have had a system called first pass code reviewers. So what you'll do is you'll take, say the people who are still newer, and they'll send it to, I don't know, you'll send a code review to Sean, and Sean will be a first pass reviewer, and then I'll pick on Protip because I work with Protip, and then Protip will be the primary reviewer. But you and Sean go back and forth, iron out the little things. You both learn about code reviewing, and then eventually you gain the skills to become a primary reviewer. The thing if you're doing that is make sure that you're communicating like this is definitely a short-term hit to productivity, but it's one of those long-term team health things that's really, really important.
Hey, awesome talk.
Appreciate it.
I'm not drowning in code reviews right now. So
Totally not. I would never know what that feels
totally
like.
not. But no, my question is more, I guess, more like a clarification. So
Yeah.
you had mentioned earlier in the talk, like we just said, like how do you balance drowning in code reviews, but also being like a tech lead
Yeah.
and saying I want to make sure that all the code reviews do come to me somehow.
Yeah.
And using the Punnett Square, I guess,
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah.
So what because I don't know, like if I get something in my email and someone is sending me, hey, can you take a look at this? I still feel like I'm being assigned it. So
Yeah.
like, how do you balance the two?
Can I ask you a quick question? How large is your team?
I guess
How many people might be sending you code reviews?
I have 20 right now.
You have 20?
Yes.
Wow. The first thing I'd say is like I'd ask if you're in a similar situation to Clive where people think that they need to put you on every code review where they don't really. So this is a problem that we had with our infrastructure teams is that everyone, and when we're writing design documents, is that everyone thinks that they need to put the infrastructure team onto their design documents because the infrastructure team knows everything. And so setting like really clear boundary lines around like, these are the things I can really help you with, and these are the things like, maybe I'll get involved with, but like, you should go talk to this other person over there. So like really proactively saying like, I don't think I'm the right person for this code review. You should like consider putting it on, like consider giving it to Protip instead is one big thing. Also, when I suggested getting all the code reviews forwarded to you, I mean sort of like having a notification stream. So not explicitly asking, hey, send me your code reviews. But I know Review Board, there's a way that there's like a groups feature. And in GitHub, I know that you can like watch a repository and get all the code reviews sent to you. So people aren't actively assigning you as a reviewer, but you are aware that that code review is going out. So that's I think, the clarification. We have time for one more question.
Hi. Do you have any tips for when you're reviewing code from someone more senior? In ways like how to give feedback to someone that's more experienced than you, and maybe like how you can like learn the most from like reviewing that person's PR?
Yeah, well, first thing I'd say is, one, it's awesome that your senior engineers are sending code reviews to junior engineers because that's a great way for senior engineers to be sharing knowledge with more junior engineers. And it's super important for team health. If you look at bettercode.reviews, which is back here, one of the big things that they call out as like failure modes is our senior engineers never get their code reviewed by junior engineers. So the fact that that's happening is one, awesome. The second answer I'd say is like, honestly, the first thing I'd say is don't review it any differently than you would review someone else's code. I remember when I was an intern at Yelp, we had this awesome tech lead. Her name was Carmen, and she landed this massive PR for like this enormously important feature, and she assigned like 2 interns to be primaries on it because we were like the only people on the team at the time. And we're like, you want us to review your platform implementation? And so I would say don't review it any differently, but like ultimately I did the best that I could, and we did the best that we could to review it because everyone's code needs to go through review. But more than that, also if you're seeing things that are new and different, like you can ask questions about stuff that is interesting or surprising to you. And if you see patterns, one of the great things that you can do is like ask them like, oh, I see that you like do a really great job of making sure that like your test coverage is always really high. Like what are strategies that you have in order to make sure that you're doing that? So both you don't do anything different on the reviewing side, but if you're getting the opportunity to review a more experienced person's code, definitely use that as a learning opportunity for yourself to provide jumping off points that you could learn more about in the future.
Cool, thank you.
I think Marcy's coming on stage, so I think that means my time is up. Or Sean, are you meeting in the middle?
We're using a pincer instead of a shepherd's hook.
Yeah, it all works.
Thank you, Jonathan, so very much for your talk and for helping us all get better at making code reviews.